Hi there, I'm John from sandboxranch.com, and today we'll make a whole bunch of custom rounded banks using poplar, and I'll also show you a screw up that we did with red oak. When I started sandboxranch.com, I went with red oak originally because I wanted a really hard hardwood, and that was the best hardwood to use aesthetically and so forth to start the website with. But I always wanted to differentiate into other kind of wood species. And so today I got into what you see here is poplar. Poplar is also a hardwood. It's not a softwood. It's about half the hardness of red oak, but you have to keep in mind these are not man-made products. So, one might have, a lot harder hardness, and another one have a softer softness to it. So there is definitely some variation and some sort of in between them for them. What I use poplar here in the shop for a lot is actually these kind of things. So this is just a tray, and poplar is actually a wonderful wood for that kind of stuff. It's nice and soft, it's not too heavy. You won't cut yourself on the edges, which will possibly happen with the red oak. And when it comes to red oak, you can see here, it has a very, very strong grain to it. And of course this is laminated. If you look carefully, you can actually see the laminations. But if you go like this, it's a little bit harder to see. But the poplar is a lot, it's a lot more lighter in color. It weighs definitely not a lot less, but a little bit less. It is still a hardwood. And it machines just wonderfully. So the nice thing about mixing and matching the woods is the machine doesn't care what kind of woods we're cutting with it. It's all the same design process. It's all the same feeds and speeds and all that kind of stuff, because I have specialized bits for this kind of material. So I'm so overpowered when it comes to making these that when I do a really hardwood like red oak, or I do a soft hardwood like poplar, there's no settings difference whatsoever. I shop bought PRS Alpha, which I've since sold. So this is one of the last few videos of it actually working. What I'm doing here is flattening it. I don't have a jointer in the shop. So basically what I've been using for the last couple months as a joiner is actually my CNC machine. It actually does a wonderful job of that. So one end of my CNC machine is the jointing, where I flatten both sides. And when I flatten both sides, that means I have something that's flat and parallel and cleaned up at the same time, that I then do on the other side of the table, and I do the glue up. Once the glue up is done, I put it on my thermwood, and what the thermwood does is flatten the top and the bottom. So that means I have a clean surface on both sides of the bank, basically, and everything's nice and clean as well. After that, because I have a tool changer, I actually have the machine set up to start going production right away. I still have to screw in the corners, as you can see here. I had some issues with it raising up. So again, every time I do this, I refine the process. I get a more efficient design, I get more efficient production, and it just speeds everything up to make it more cost effective to order custom banks from sandboxranch.com. Now in this case here, it's a relatively fast process, as you can see, but it takes a couple hours to do all this kind of work. It's just really sped up video. Now there's quite a lot of steps involved with making these custom banks and the custom woodworking things that I do here in the shop. And so in this case here for the banks, it requires a lot of prototyping. Now you might be wondering, why do I need to do prototypes if I have something that works perfectly? Well, that's the issue. There's a lot of things I can not see or can't simulate properly. So for instance, you have here the dinosaurs that I made out of poplar, and it looks great. But this acrylic does not fit on the front of it properly. And if you look really closely, you can sort of see why. You definitely see it better here. So you can see here how the router stopped here, but the laser continued here. The reason for that is because I can't really simulate a 1/2-inch bit in the software that I use for my laser. I sort of guesstimate it, but I can't get it perfectly. And that's why generally when I make these banks, I make an MDF front like this first. So what the MDF does, this is cheap stuff. I do a lot of MDF jobs, and whenever I have little chunks here and there, I keep them because I know I'll be using them for this application here. So if you can see here, for instance, you see the MDF would go on the front, and it would tell you if it fits right or not. If it doesn't fit, well then you do another one and you redo the design, and another one, And then once it does fit, you do the acrylic. Now what I want for the acrylic is something that fits perfectly like this. Now this one here, if you look really carefully, you can see an issue with the bank. And you can see here that there's splitting. Now splitting can be caused by a lot of different factors. I also have a split here in the S. And well, this one has other issues. So the splitting can be caused by just the wood is just, happenstance. I happen to put a screw in the wrong spot that's a little bit weaker wood and then it splits. There's ways of fixing that, of course, which is what I'll do in the shop. For the design, what I would do is generally, if I see a split like this here, and I don't see one here, they're exactly the same distance away. So what I'll do is I'll just move this in maybe a 1/16 of an inch, and generally that solves the problem. So every bank that I do as a prototype, I look at it very carefully and I try to find any sort of errors that could possibly happen in the future, and I solve them now before I make a ton of S's. Other issues that come up with design are like this here. You have the bank. You notice how there's nothing supporting the screws. So for this here, I just happened to make the coin slot a little bit wider and I didn't see it on the screen. So when the laser did its work, which is perfect, and the router did its work, that is perfect, it did exactly what I told it to, which is wrong. So this is an easy fix as well. Either just make the coin slot narrower or just move the screws over. Small things like that. And this is what the prototype wood looks like. So again, this is just 1/4 inch. I use basically any sort of scrap in the shop I use for this purpose, because basically I'm just cutting it, testing a fit, and then I literally just throw it in the fire pit afterwards. After that checks out, I do the acrylic version of it, because acrylic costs a lot more than MDF. And in this case here specifically, there was actually a big issue with the red oak. So you'll see in the production that the red oak seems to work properly all the way through, and none of this stuff worked with the acrylic, with the MDF. Now I couldn't figure out why, because if it works with this, it works with the poplar. Why wouldn't it work with the red oak? It's the same design, the same, everything's identical. It just wouldn't fit. And if you look at it closely, you can see that everything is just off by maybe a 1/16 all the way around. So again, that's kind of strange. So I took a look at the bit, and what happened is, hopefully you can see this. If you look at the bit, not only is it black, which is a bad thing, but the edge is actually sheared right off. Now, how the shearing happened, I have absolutely no idea. It must have happened really early in the process. There must have been either a nail or something in the red oak that I didn't notice when I was laminating it, gluing it, all that kind of stuff. It must have been embedded in the wood itself. And what happened is, when this 1/2 inch cutter went and hit the nail, it cut the nail, no problem. But it also sheared off a little bit of the bit. And because of that, everything here didn't work out, because now I'm off a 1/16 everywhere because the bit is not full. It's got a little section missing from it. So those are the fun sort of issues that I get to play with. I had a lot more bit problems earlier when I was prototyping all these banks, because I was using the wrong kind of bits, I was using the wrong kind of process. So every time I do this an iteration of banks, I have things further optimized, further efficient, and so less issues come up. And I also have checklists now. So check for this, check for that, check, check, check. And then, that makes sure that you have a lot less problems that you would have otherwise. After doing red oak banks for the last, ever since I started prototyping all the products that you see on the website, CNCKing.com, I decided to get some poplar this time. And just like, it's kind of fun to have diversity in not just products, but also materials. In my sort of day job, I do CNCKing.com, which is custom fabrication, wood, plastic, metal, literally any kind of material, and we make stuff out of it. Now in this case here, it's poplar. It's a really hard, it's a soft hardwood. So to give you an idea, red oak is roughly 1200 hardness. I forget the unit that they use for that. And for poplar, it's roughly half that. Now you gotta remember there's some diversity in the density with, it's not a man-made product, it's a natural product. So some red oak might be down maybe 500-600, and some poplar might be all the way up to 1200. It really depends on where in the piece of wood you're working from. So when I buy the rough sawn lumber from the mill, it's literally rough sawn. You can see all the marks from the huge saw they used to cut up these big slabs of poplar. It's the same thing with the red oak. And it's the same thing with other wood species that I have here in the shop. Where I really noticed the difference was in cutting with the table saw. I hope to upgrade this as well later on. I'm slowly upgrading my equipment from 110 to 220, and that just gives me more power, more capability here in the shop for all the projects that we do, including cutting something. I noticed the big difference here because I wasn't kicking off the breakers as much as if I was doing red oak, but it's still a relatively slow process to make basically a huge slab into something that I could actually machine and make custom banks out of. Just to give you an idea of the serendipity that happens here in the shop when I do custom production. Originally on sandboxranch.com, I made all the coasters, the chemical element coasters. And I was at a show recently and I had the idea of I was also doing banks. And I thought, well, you know, if I wanted a bank of, in this case, mercury, how would I do it? And the idea I had was just to make a square with the same mercury as you can see here. So of course I could do paint filling, all this kind of stuff to make it more apparent, just like the wooden coaster. But you can see how the light plays with it. But the other nice thing about this option, so to speak, is that, you know, I also do custom projects for people who want banks with images or other kind of stuff that don't really fit well into the banking sort of mold. For instance, here we have an H out of poplar, and the customer had like a shape of, it was basically a shape of somebody skating, and it was so thin that if you put any coins in it, it just wouldn't work as a bank, and you also have problems with the balance of it. So the idea for them as well is, why don't we make it a square? Of course, this can be any shape. I make them here in the shop on demand, but in this case here is a square, and I laser engraved and I did the black paint filling of the skater, and it worked absolutely perfectly. Now, making all these custom banks, regardless of the wood species I use, actually is a multi-day process. The first day is cutting up the size, doing the glue up, and then the next day, once the glue is dry, sometimes it takes a little bit longer for it to dry depending on the species. The next day is flattening it again using my thermwood. Now in this case here, I have the thermwood actually flattening, doing the job that the shop bot did in the previous earlier part of this video. And the reason for that is because I sold the shop bot, so everything is now being done with one machine. It's a little bit faster to do it with this machine, of course, but the finish and the quality of that stuff is all the same for this specific process. Now, having a joiner would be a lot more manual work. Having a CNC to do it for you, you essentially press a button and it does most of the work for you. There are definitely some costs to that because I end up wasting a lot more material because I can only go as low as the lowest piece, and as a result I waste, you know, some of the material doing this process, but I save it in, you know, me moving around and do some other work. There's tons of other work to do in the shop to make these banks, in this case here, possible. So it's not like I'm sitting around on a couch watching TV all day. I could do all the design processes that have to be done before the actual bank even gets cut, assign things to the tool changer and so forth. So there's quite a bit of work involved, physical and mental, virtual and physical, to make these banks possible. So let's do a quick comparison of red oak versus poplar. They're both hardwoods, and also compare the laser engraving. So here we have red oak, and we have poplar. This one's poplar, this one's red oak. And this was just laser engraved clear on clear acrylic. You can see the engraving. This one was also laser engraved on clear acrylic. The difference is you have black paint fill. We offer a whole bunch of different paint fill colors that you want for your bank. So, you know, pick whatever color you want, we can do that. Side by side, you can see the red oak is a lot darker color. You can also see the grain is a lot stronger. And when we do the finishing on these, it just accentuates the grain even more. So that's why for the red oak, it ends up looking a lot browner and redder, while this one here gets a little bit more I'd say not greener, but it gets a lot more paler when you do the contrast. So here we have some laser engraving on the back. And this one as well, just to show you the comparison of the laser engravings. So you see the red oak is definitely more visible. This one had to be sanded a little bit. And they're both using exactly the same screws as well. Now another thing to keep in mind is the size. So our standard size for all the banks is 8 inches tall, which is what this is, and this is 10 inches. So you can see how 10-inch square adds 2 inches not just in height, but also in width. So something to keep in mind. I do a lot of custom banks that are, you know, they're customized size. So let's say they needed to go in a specific spot that's only, 6 inches. That's something to keep in mind. This here can be scaled down to whatever size you want, and you don't really lose that much for coins. But for like letter banks and shapes and that kind of stuff, if you go too small, it doesn't become a very functional bank. But with this, at least with this shape here and other shapes that I'm coming out with, the sizing can vary dramatically however you want. And because we make every component here in the shop, it can be customized however you can possibly imagine for your custom banks. This is the part that I enjoy the most out of the whole process. I finished cutting all the boards. Now what I'm doing is flattening them all, as you can see here. And that is done after everything's glued in solid. So the nice thing about this process is that after this is done here, you'll have a nice clean board to start making custom banks out of. Now there's, again, quite a few steps involved making all this possible. What you can see here is just lots of flattening, changing the bits, and so forth. What you see here is actually the chamfering. And what the chamfering is doing is making all of the corners sort of a 45-degree angle. For red oak, it's really necessary because it's really, really sharp. For poplar, it's not as essential, but I kind of like doing it now more than anything else, because one, it gives me a preview of where all the banks will be cut. In case I screwed up anything on the layout, I could physically see it right on there while it's being made, and I make any adjustments if I need to. And you can also see the power of having a tool changer here. I didn't have a tool changer for, 20 years of having a CNC machine. So I could definitely appreciate not having to physically grab the tool, redo the Z-axis, redo a lot of manual work. And it's just mind-blowing to me that how dramatically more efficient I am with this machine. Now this machine here is around 12,000 pounds. So it's very, very rigid. The bits that I use are 1/2 inch. So again, they're very strong bits, very strong machine. And as a result, all vibrations are almost gone when I produce the banks. That's very important because I want to have a nice clean finish. I am one guy in the shop and I can't spend hours cleaning up and sanding every one of the banks off the machine after doing production. I got better things and other things to do here in the shop. So what this allows me to do is basically have a finished bank, regardless of the wood species that I use to make them out of, basically a finished product. I might have to do a little bit of sanding here and there just to clean up a couple of little splinters or that kind of stuff. But basically everything is done, from the excavation even to drilling the holes. And then what I do is after I checked everything over, I go over to the laser and I do the window in the front and basically ship it out. Now if there's other finishing or other kind of customization to do, that's done with the laser. It's a very different process. But as you can see here, you see it going up and down. What it's doing now is actually drilling all the holes. I used to manually do that with a drill. What I would do is use a template, and each letter had a different template, and I'd just manually drill them out. Having the machine do that, it just saves a tremendous amount of time, and it's actually a lot more accurate, and most importantly, they're all the same depth. So that's a really nice thing to have. So what you can see here is now what I'm doing is, as it's being cut out, I'm actually doing measurements and things like that, just to make sure that I have the proper depth. I don't have any other issues with the machine or any other problems that could possibly be there. Now it's changing bits quite a bit. I'm still streamlining a lot of these processes here. So what it does a rough cut around the bank, and then it does, with a finishing bit, it goes back over everything and cleans everything right up. Now the finish quality of the rougher is actually not bad, but I could produce a better finish quality using the finisher than otherwise. Now this is the part that I still definitely want to streamline with a bandsaw, and that's cutting them out. Then I have my little router table and I clean up all the little ledges all the way around. All right, so let's take a look at the banks that were produced in this run that were actually perfect. And here you have the R. This is poplar, of course. They're all 8 inches tall, but we could customize them to any size you want. And you have the black onyx screws, which are the default that I have here just for the pictures I take for the sandboxranch.com website. Here you have a T. Of course, back. So you can tell right away that it's poplar, not red oak, just by the color. It's a lot lighter color. It's a very different aesthetic. And of course, these are the rounded banks. So the rounded, everything is rounded compared to the square banks that I made in the first round. And originally when I was designing stuff for sandboxranch.com, I was going to mix them both together and develop them as they go. That's when I started having problems, and I said, well, hang on a second, let me get one alphabet sorted before I do the next alphabet, because some people prefer a rounded aesthetic. This is the Q. Some people prefer a rounded aesthetic to a square one. So just to give you an idea, here's a red oak R. So it's very square-ish. This is, I don't have an R here for, actually I do have an R, I think. I'll find it later on. So here's an R, and here's, you can tell right away how rounded it is by comparison. Let me see if I have an R. There we go. Thought so. So here we have the poplar, and here we have the red oak. You can tell the difference. They're both the same height, although the camera might not make it seem that way. So you see how this one's much more square-ish. This one's more roundish. Of course, you have the C, which I showed you a little bit earlier. Here's the L. Now some of these letters are duplicated, and that's the nice thing about CNC equipment, is that I can make endless letters on demand. So in this case here, these are actually going to another customer. Both of their kids' names start with C, so that's why I have 2 C's. But you can see how they're completely identical. The only differentiation is actually the wood grain. So you can see here the wood grain is a little bit different. And that's the nice thing about wood. Each one is completely identical, no matter how identical I try to make them. Each one is completely different to the other one. And of course we can mix and match the wood. So if you wanted, let's say, one C out of poplar, the other one of red oak, or the other one out of black walnut, whatever, we can do it for you here in the shop. So with sandboxranch.com, I want to do a lot of customization throughout the whole process. So you can choose different wood species, different sizing, different fonts, different everything for your bank. And then when it comes to the laser, well, you don't have to go with the clear acrylic. You go to the red acrylic, orange, yellow, what have you, blue. So you have total customization, wood species to finished product there. Now in this case here, this is a project I had to ship out right away. You can see at the top right, and that's actually a black paint fill. I can't do black with the laser if it's acrylic. I can do it if it's polycarbonate, but in this case here is just the customer wanted it out of acrylic, so that's what I made. So when I do the laser work, it cuts all the holes in the acrylic. So basically all I have to do is put the window on top, and the holes match between the laser and the router. And again, that's just mind-blowing because I used to manually do all that stuff when I was first prototyping and making first productions of all these banks. And that's why one person can do all of these processes, because I have multiple machines and equipment and processes involved that make it actually possible. What you see there, me taking off the acrylic, is actually the masking. Otherwise, it would be a sort of a black burned soot on the underside. Because you got to remember, the laser is actually cutting a petroleum product, and that produces black smoke, and the black smoke comes back up and sticks to whatever surface is around. So by having that masking on the top and the front, or the top and the back, or the front and the back of the acrylic, means that when I peel that off, all of that soot comes off too. So you have a nice clean surface to work from that the customer, I guess, really appreciates compared to having black soot on everything. So if you want custom banks, customize however you want. And of course, if you want some other things that are not on the website, or you have ideas for other things that you'd like to have us make for you, go to sandboxranch.com and contact us, or just order them online.